Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's video essay brought to you by my Chessie from the Parent Trap shirt. Just kidding, it's brought to you by Betterment. We'll talk about them in a second. I am here today to talk about a subject that has been on a lot of people's minds over the past few weeks due to some of this maybe. We are talking about tradwives. And although the definitions may vary depending on who you ask, essentially tradwives is short for traditional wives, women who model a very specific gender heteronormative view of what it means to be a generally stay-at-home wife and mother, often with an explicitly Christian foundation. But it's not just a few zeitgeisty news stories about social media stars that have gotten a lot of us thinking about this concept. It's also some of the people who happen to be running for president.
That we're effectively run in this country by a bunch of childless cat ladies.
Vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party, J.D. Vance, has been going viral himself recently for some comments recently resurfaced from a 2021 interview where he said, quote, "We are effectively running this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. How does it make any sense that we've turned our country over to people who don't have a direct stake in it?" I do have one important correction to issue there, which is that I am a childless dog lady. But suffice to say, the point stands, we are now having a pretty substantial cultural conversation over whether or not childless people have a stake in the future of the country, or in some cases, even deserve to vote. Now, this is all pretty poignant, of course, in light of the historic candidacy of Vice President Kamala Harris, who, although is a proud stepmother, does not have children of her own. I actually don't know if she owns cats, but either way, there's clearly a very direct link between the childless cat ladies who are running the Democratic Party and also America, and Vice President Harris. Now, as I've said many times on this channel, I am a child-free by choice queen, although if you want to call me childless, go ahead, baby. There's nothing less about my life, so have fun. Also, I just think the term childless really implies that you want children but can't have them, so, you know, whatever. So I'm, of course, more prime than most to defend not just the concept of choosing not to have children, but their pretty important role in society. Because like it or not, as child-free folks, we do also, for example, pay taxes. In fact, we are even more tax-burdened to pay for the society that we all live in, and notably the children who are not ours live in. I also just completely reject the notion that children have to be your own biological children in order for you to care about them or to consider them part of your community. I also call into question the idea that the only relationships that really matter in terms of adults and children are parents to their own children. But it's probably not worth getting into all of that because then that just kind of takes the fight onto these really ridiculous terms. The point is, there is a pretty substantial cultural conversation happening right now about the role of childless women in society and kind of by extension the role of mothers. Because lest we forget, many of the same people who are likely to call out the women not having children as being essentially miserable harpies who are determined to destroy the country along with their lives, they also have pretty strong views about what it means to be a wife and mother. J.D. Vance's own wife, for example, is a Yale-educated lawyer, yet when he speaks about her, he's most likely to do so in terms of her being first and foremost a wife and mom. And the general stereotype of godless young millennials and Gen Z not having children anymore does have some statistical merit to it. Quote, "Birth rates are falling in the US. After the highs of the baby boom in the mid-20th century and the lows of the baby bust in the 70s, birth rates were relatively stable for nearly 50 years. But during the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, birth rates declined sharply, and they've kept falling. In 2007, average birth rates were around 2 children per woman. By 2021, levels had dropped more than 20%, close to the lowest level in a century." And you can watch our recent video essay on why people can no longer afford children for a deep dive into why that might be, and spoiler alert, it's not just because women love to party too much. But interestingly for myself, as it pertains to the tradwife question, I am a proudly child-free by choice, Manhattan-dwelling, coastal elite, Democrat, liberal harpy, but my sister, and I rarely talk about my family on these channels just because I respect their privacy, in many ways fits into the ideal of what people like Mr. Vance are calling for. She's 28, lives in the rural South, she's a homesteader, and she's a stay-at-home mom to 3 children and counting. So although I have a pretty typical childless NPR tote bag carrying liberal elite experience, I am pretty close to its exact opposite, and in many ways the kind of lifestyle being modeled, or in some cases being spoofed, by the tradwife content. Because I see up close just how different it is financially and aesthetically to actually be living this life that many people are selling as a dream, typified by content creators creators like Ballerina Farm, who we'll get into, and the reality for people like my sister who are actually making it work. Single-income homes with children are 3 times more likely to live in poverty as double-income families with children, and we'll get into more on that later. And it's also worth noting that at least as it pertains to the dreamy farm girl aesthetic, agricultural workers and small-scale farmers in particular have been suffering financially in the past few decades. Quote, farm debt at $416 billion is at an all-time high. More than half of all farmers have lost money every year since 2013 and lost more than 1,644 this year. Farm loan delinquencies are rising. That whole article, while depressing, is worth reading, but we'll get into more of that later. The point is, in an era where being a woman who prioritizes her career or who chooses not to have children is being more villainized than ever, we have a simultaneous rise and popularity of a very specific type of womanhood and motherhood being modeled to us. But how did we get here and what can we do about it? Well, let's start by tracing its roots with Chapter 1, Tradwives, the backlash to having it all. If Tradwives have had something of a zeitgeisty moment lately, it is at least in part because of the zeitgeist that came before it, that of the girl boss. Now, the hashtag girl boss, a term popularized by the 2014 book of the same name by entrepreneur Sophia Amoruso, became a kind of catch-all for a very specific type of female aspiration in the mid-2010s. Quote, in 2014, Amoruso published her best-selling memoir, hashtag girl boss, about starting her company, but a year later she stepped down as CEO amid layoffs, revenue losses, and a lawsuit filed by former employees who alleged that they had illegally been terminated while pregnant. The suit ultimately settled. But outside of the namesake's origin and its many scandals that followed, it came to be a defining archetype for women of my generation to aspire to. And there were many real-world reasons to feel like it was a bit of an era. On a global scale, for example, the 2010s were an excellent time for women leaders in several countries. Angela Merkel was rounding the corner on 10 years as Chancellor of Germany. 4 of Canada's most powerful provinces were helmed by women. Jacinda Ardern was only a few years away from becoming New Zealand's Prime Minister. And Hillary Clinton was running what at the time seemed like an unlosable campaign. And beyond politics, it was also a time when an even remotely witty soundbite that had a slightly political sounding bent to it was cause for weeks of fawning, unexamined good press. Anne Hathaway drowned in accolades for her comeback to Extra's Jerry Penacoli's invasive questions about her catsuit and fitness regime in The Dark Knight Rises, finally asking him, "Are you trying to fit into a catsuit?" J.K. Rowling was still beloved and powerful, and ensemble comedies like Bridesmaids and Pitch Perfect provided a fun, feminine alternative to a lot of the dude-filled comedies of the 2000s. But as foundational as the girl boss felt during her time, in many ways she was actually just a slight rebranding of the previous concept of a woman having it all. This is something we go into at length, by the way, in our latest TFD book, Beyond Getting By. But, quote, Helen Gurley Brown's 1982 Having It All, Love, Success, Sex, Money, Even If You're Starting With Nothing. Brown was the editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan magazine for 32 years, and according to the New York Times reporting, the book's title was not her idea. She detested it. Her biographer, Jennifer Scanlon, told me that months before Having It All was published, Brown wrote a letter to her editors pleading with them to use the title she wanted, The Mouseburger Plan. So I guess she could have it all except good branding ideas. Anyway, if we're looking for cultural icons of the having it all mentality, perhaps none would typify the idea more, in media at least, than the women of Sex and the City. And if you want 4 deep dives on the finances of each of the Sex and the City women, along with their career and life choices, you can check out our podcast, $40,000 on Shoes. That's linked below as well. Essentially, though, the girl boss and the having it all girl were ways for women to claim ownership over the professional and financial sphere in a way that they previously hadn't, with particular emphasis on balancing it with their domestic life. Lest we forget, up until fairly recently, women had almost no control over their own finances. So the idea, for a while at least, of the woman with a baby, a briefcase, wearing stilettos, holding a martini, was extremely aspirational, if for no other reason than because it represented having options to do all of those things on your own terms. But what became clear very quickly is that this notion of having it all, or girl bossing your way into a corner office by working yourself nearly to death, is not really aspirational in a context where women still take on the majority of domestic labor, more on that in a minute, and wages are falling for everyone, so we have to work twice as hard just to keep up. And from the ashes of those trends rose new concepts in more recent years, like the stay-at-home girlfriend, soft life, sprinkle sprinkle, and most relevantly for this video, the tradwife. Because, quote, according to Google Trends, online searches of the term tradwife began to rise in popularity around mid-2018 and reached high levels during the early 2020s. And, quote, although the use of social media and the power of tradwife influencers may be new, the use of media to reinforce conservative social norms is not. Women in 18th century Anglo-America, for example, were inundated by conduct literature, writing in magazines, newspapers, and novels that dictated how they ought to behave, especially in their marriage. The good wife, for example, was to be strictly and conscientiously virtuous, chaste, pure, and unblemished in every thought, word, and deed. More prescriptions followed. She is humble and modest from reason and conviction, submissive from choice, and obedient from inclination. She was the helpmeet of her husband, always making it her business to serve and oblige him. Her happiness was contingent upon his own. The tradwife image, this woman who typifies an old-fashioned, usually religious, overtly conservative view of what a household should be, can come in many different flavors, and we'll get into it in a bit, but on social media you can find many variations of her, not unlike Barbie. But at its core, the tradwife is meant to present an idealized version of femininity before the girl boss, or even having it all. Rather than claiming equal ownership over the professional and personal spheres, she entirely rejects financial independence or professional success, choosing to focus entirely on the domestic sphere while her husband, because being hetero as hell is also a part of this obviously, takes care of everything else. There's a pretty joyful representation not just in the day-to-day work of being a wife and mother, but in very intentionally giving over financial leadership and professional dependence to your husband. And I will say it's worth repeating, for all of its flaws, both the having it all concept and at some level the girl boss ideal was a response, as we noted, to a world in which women didn't have the option to have their own money, or weren't being paid equally for equal work, or weren't even allowed in the workplace.
To hear a first-person perspective on tradwife culture and the reality of living it, we spoke with Ashley, a former traditional wife and current law student.
I was raised in a mainstream Mormon family in a relatively small town in Utah, and was born in the early 90s. So I'm 33 now. Growing up in Mormonism, the belief system is such that it's not a surprise to anybody, but there's a strong emphasis placed on traditional family values. So I grew up with that background, which led into me getting married at 19, which is young, but they're not uncommon, pretty normal. And was just pigeonholed right into the stay-at-home traditional wife role. And I consider myself lucky that I got myself out about 4 years later. We were married between 4 and 5 years and had 2 kids together, and found my way out. So I did find myself in that traditional role, but only did it for about 4 or 5 years before I started finding my way out.
But regardless of its specific iterations, what is undeniable is that this content is hugely popular on social media. In addition to mommy blogging as a genre in many ways pioneering our current model of life sharing on social media, being a mom online is big business when it comes to content. Quote, a child's presence in YouTube videos can rake in considerable profits. In 2019, the Pew Research Center found videos with children who appear to be under the age of 13 received 3 times as many views as other videos. 9-year-old Ryan Kaji, star of the Ryan's World YouTube channel, topped Forbes' 2020 list of highest paid YouTubers, estimated to have netted $29.5 million from his content and product lines. So in the absence of all of the pink-washed capitalism imagery of the girl boss that dominated millennial social feeds back in the 2010s, we have in Soft Life, Stay-at-Home Girlfriends, Sprinkle Sprinkle, and of course the Tradwife, this very different vision of what it means to be a woman in today's very difficult capitalist context that in its best and most good faith interpretation only treats the symptoms rather than even acknowledging the illness, but which makes for extremely entertaining content in the meantime. Which brings us to our next chapter. Chapter 2. Unfair play. So as we've discussed, modern women are in a lose-lose situation when it comes to their professional and personal lives. While they're increasingly required to work due to economic constraints, they're also largely responsible for the majority of childcare and domestic labor in the household. And to take it back to the girl boss specifically and why that image clearly has started to fall out of favor and people are clamoring to replace it with something more aspirational, we now have enough data to know that even the women who get to the highest levels of professional success are still trapped in this dynamic.
As with most things that are dangerous like this, they find appeal amongst people because there's an element of it that's true. But they're leaving some stuff out, right? That the reality is that in our modern world, as our economy is run right now, women are severely devalued and we're expected to do all kinds of unpaid labor. And I can speak to that as someone who's had to be the full-time parent and a full-time employee. It's impossible. It's so hard. I'm bone tired most of the time. And I can see the appeal of a system that proclaims to value that in women and says, hey, we love that you do this. We want to value you in this. And we value these traditional family roles. And it's all fine and beautiful and wonderful until, but it doesn't take into account the realities of our current economic system. And radical me thinks that, I don't think this is radical, but I believe that a lot of women's labor should be paid and compensated. That goes unpaid and uncompensated. The labor and work that we put in on the home front to be able to care for kids and take care of the home is so much work. And COVID, if it taught us nothing else, taught us how much we rely on women's unpaid labor to keep the economy running. But the reality is our current economic system doesn't value that. It just doesn't.
Quote, even high-achieving women who are married continue to carry the lion's share of domestic responsibilities. Only 9% of their husbands assume primary responsibility for meal preparation, 10% for laundry, and 5% for cleaning the house. When it comes to children, husbands don't do much better. Only 9% of them take time off from work when a child is sick, 9% take the lead in helping children with homework, and 3% organize activities such as playdates and summer camp. Okay, I'm sorry. I know I don't have kids. This is not really like my place to... What's going on, guys? 3%? Only 10% of them are doing the laundry. Maybe this one hurts me so bad because I hate doing laundry and my husband is in charge of that chore, but these numbers are so bleak, you guys. And that's for women who are really successful. I hope these women are at least cheating on their husbands. I'm sorry. But of course, don't take it from me, take it from the author of Fair Play herself, and a woman who used to be in this kind of marriage, Eve Rodsky.
I was really suffering under these assumptions of my husband thinking because he made more money than me, I would do more unpaid labor. Mm-hmm. And then those imbalances start to grow. And then all of a sudden you're stuck being the fulfiller of someone's smoothie needs. And it's nothing you ever thought your life was going to be. And then you wake up one day and you say, is this it? And then you start drinking mommy juice and then your life sort of unravels. So for those of you who don't have children, maybe, you know, like Chelsea, you're not going to want them after this. But I will say that the hardest thing as I was being abandoned by my workplace and my spouse was everybody around me that was smart and strong did not have a handle on this issue, and that was scaring me.
But the problem with all of this, because yes, acknowledging the problem is real, saying that the girl boss mentality doesn't work even for the women it superficially works for is real, and that we need better alternatives is real. The problem is that the reality of the tradwife response, this idea that we can retreat into a previous iteration of heterosexual marriage to find identity and meaning and, most importantly, financial security, and the implication that it's evil feminists who are the ones preventing us from doing that, is that it makes no sense. Ultimately, one spouse not working in most households is just a privileged choice, and one that more women would likely make if it were financially feasible. And even for women who do stay home, for most of them, it just means even more financial struggle, not less of it. The median income for families with one employed parent in 2019 was $38,259. Approximately 54% of single-income families receive some type of government assistance, and in the US, 23.7% of single-income families lived below the poverty level in 2019.
To talk a little bit deeper about the intersection of money, influencers, content, divorce, gender, and everything in between, we spoke to friend of TFD and incredible content creator, Francesca Ramsey.
I think for me, especially as a divorcee who, you know, when we talked about finances of divorce, I feel like anxiety when I see women get into relationships and say like, I'm ready to be a stay-at-home mom. I'm not going to work. And I think about the financial aspect of, oh my God, if you get a divorce, I hope you're going to be okay. I hope you're going to be okay in the sense that like, if you're with somebody who has a lot of money and can potentially make the divorce very lengthy and difficult for you, if you have kids, if you have property, those are things that I never would have thought about until I'd gotten divorced myself. And that's what I thought about when I read the Ballerina Farm article. I was like, man, can she even afford to get divorced? Like, what would that look like? Her husband has a ton of money. Like, they have 8 kids, you know? So I definitely think that the push for women to be smarter about their finances is a good one. But I haven't really necessarily heard the conversations that I would think are beneficial, you know, the talking about prenuptial agreements and really having hard conversations about your finances with your partner. What are your financial goals? Do you want to have kids? What's your credit score? You know, what kind of debt do you have? All of those unsexy conversations. I'm anxious for. I mean, I think that's kind of what the financial diet does, which is wonderful, but there isn't someone doing it specifically through the lens of hetero relationships in the way that we've got sprinkle on one end of the spectrum and then the tradwives on the other. Like, where is the more moderate, responsible version? I don't know.
In fact, a recent article from an author who refers to herself as a former tradwife explains that this was only a choice she made in the first place because her husband was earning enough money to do so. Quote, "And let me start off by saying that thanks to my spouse's work, we were in a position for me to stay home. The privilege of that choice is not lost on me. My income would have been surplus to our daily needs and would definitely have funded some more exorbitant materialistic wants, but after weighing the pros and cons, I realized what was important for me was to spend my children's early years together with them on a full-time basis." Not to quote my beloved Mad Men here, but
well, are you lucky to have decisions?
But essentially, the current situation for women is that even high-earning ones are largely responsible for household duties, not unlike the way tradwives perform the tasks for likes and views and the curation of a specific aesthetic. They're just not really given credit for it because, surprise, we judge working moms. It's not a coincidence that women tend to earn less money with each subsequent child they have, while men tend to earn more, because we hold the view, subconsciously or not, that women should be home with their children taking care of them, while men are perceived as more serious about their work for having families. And quite frankly, when you look at the stats of what men and women are doing in their households when they have children, it's not wrong to assume that the man's largely not going to be compromising his work hours. But at the same time, the majority of women who are actually tradwives in practice are in no way doing it for a luxurious monthly stipend and likely couldn't even afford the skyrocketing costs of childcare, even if they wanted to.
And then it was the years following the divorce and trying to pick myself back up economically that I realized how exploited I had been and how disadvantaged I was because of that. So going from there, when I found myself divorced with 2 kids, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And I had spent the last 4 or 5 years trying to support my husband through his degree, which he just didn't take seriously. He just kind of fucked around, didn't go to class, got awful grades, kept getting put on probation, and still never finished it in the time we were married. And I remember being so upset when I finally left him, and I just thought I could have my law degree right now. I could have it right now if I had just done that instead of supporting him. And now I have no career, I have no money, and I have 2 babies that I have to figure out how to take care of. And I had zero. I had no dollars, no money, no job whatsoever. And I just had to start over.
As of 2023, childcare costs are currently increasing at twice the rate of inflation. And in some instances, childcare literally costs more than college tuition. Quote, around 47% of parents spend up to $18,000 a year on their childcare expenses, according to a new cost of care report, while 20% of parents indicated they spend more than $36,000 in a year.
When I had to start over, so I got divorced, didn't have a job. I had a degree in education, elementary education, and realized very quickly that my entire salary was going to go straight to daycare if I went and tried to work full-time and had to put my kids in daycare. So I just found myself stuck. That there was, I didn't have any means by which I could go back to work and afford to have some help taking care of my kids. And so I just started my own business from home. And I moved into a small town home with my kids. We had nothing. We didn't have a table or a couch. We didn't even have a fridge, and just had to start with $0. And I would just strap my kids in a double stroller and start putting out flyers door to door to start a business teaching music lessons. I had been doing that on the side as a side hustle and thought, okay, I just need to get this many students to be able to pay my rent and buy groceries for my kids. But I was starting so much from scratch that we didn't even have furniture. And I was literally hanging up flyers on people's doors with my kids in a double stroller, just trying to figure out a way to get started again. And I managed it, but it was hard. And there were major limits to how much time I could spend working because I was also caring for my kids full time. So, yeah, that's what I did until COVID hit and I started really taking going to law school more seriously again and started putting aside time every day to just study for an hour or two on top of working and taking care of my kids by myself. And spent a year just slowly studying to take the LSAT and start getting into law school, and then eventually worked my way here. But
I was completely unaware of the financial realities of divorce, and largely because the way that it's often portrayed in media is the First Wives Club version, right? Where the man has all the money and, you know, he cheated on you and you want to take him for every penny that he's got. And, you know, my situation was very different in that I was the person that was making more money. And because we didn't have kids, my understanding of financial settlements was that there wasn't going to be one. And that was not the case. So I definitely think, and I know when I express that to other people, they are shocked. Most people that I tell, oh yeah, I had to pay a settlement, they're like, what? You're kidding me. And I'm like, oh yeah, you should, you know, make sure you really want to get married and that you've had this conversation. And well, I don't have any money. I'm like, well, you might have money later on. You don't know. And vice versa. Maybe your partner will end up having money, or you have kids, or you own properties, or you have a business. I mean, there's so many different ways that those finances need to eventually be divvied up in the event of a separation. So no, I really don't think the average person, regardless of gender, is aware of what that actually looks like. I wish there was a less uncomfortable way to talk about it. It's just not a sexy conversation. And, you know, money in general, as you know, is really difficult to talk about. And nobody wants to think about the potential of their relationship ending. It's just it's not a fun conversation to have when you are in love and you're, you know, thinking about all the potential things that you're going to do and having kids and traveling and spending holidays with your families. All of those things are top of mind, not potentially splitting up finances. And again, as somebody that never had any money, my parents don't have a lot of money. If I grew up with wealthy parents, I probably would have gone into my marriage very differently because they would have been protecting their bags. And so for those of us that don't have that type of financial literacy going into relationships, I do think there's a potential for you to really be slapped upside the head when and if things go south.
So being a traditional wife and mother, while surely great for aesthetically appealing content, in no way addresses the actual issues facing women, both at home and in the workplace. Which in some ways begs the question, who is this content for? Which is coincidentally the name of our next chapter, Chapter 3. Who is this for? Now, one thing that really differentiates the former girl boss aspiration content with the current tradwife content is that the girl boss stuff was pretty explicitly for women. When you look at the stats of who was buying these books, attending these conferences, consuming this content, it was by and large young millennial women just entering the workforce and looking for a vision of professional aspiration that lined up with their view of what success was. One only needs to look at the rise and fall of The Wing, perhaps the most literal manifestation of the girl boss era, to see that it wasn't just successful as social media content, it was a 360 real-life experience and way of viewing the world, right down to that millennial pink signature color palette. But the thing about tradwife content at its core is that it's basically impossible to discern what is genuine, because let's be clear, some of the women creating this content are actually living this life, members of these churches, having all these kids, etc., versus what is just gaming the algorithm. And what's so ironic about many of these accounts, no matter how much they lean into the I don't work because a woman's role is in the home ooh-woo stuff, they are actually girl bosses, creating their own little media empires, and in the cases of many of them, product lines.
All content creators are giving you a falsified version of their life, myself included. And sometimes it's intentional, you know, someone like the Ballerina farm of it all, you know, you don't necessarily know that she doesn't have housekeepers and she doesn't have all these things that would probably make her life a little bit easier. And I'm sure she has days where she's like, damn it, I really wish I had some extra help, but that's not what she presents online. Versus, I don't talk about who I'm dating, for example. And sometimes I'm having financial struggles or career struggles, and I don't share those on the internet, not because I'm trying to present a curated version of my life, but I would prefer to keep that part of my life personal and private to myself. So I think similarly, there are influencers in the quote unquote tradwife space that know that showing some of the not so pretty elements of their life would distort the illusion for their audience and potentially turn people off. By that same token, I think sometimes there is that curated version of authenticity as well, where people are like, you know what, this is me without any makeup on, and I'm gonna show you what it's really like. And the audience goes, wow, like she's so different because she's not all done up and she's given us the real insight. And it's like, yes, and it's also strategic on their part because they still had to put up the ring light. They still had to edit together the video. No matter how it's being presented to you, it is curated to some degree. You're never going to get a real view of someone's life because there's not a camera in front of us at all times of our lives.
And similarly, much of the most prevalent content is very clearly directed toward men, and either flatters them by saying what they want to hear, or presents easy explanations for things like their loneliness epidemic or their reduced earning potential, with things like women being too slutty these days. Let's get a montage of some of this content that looks like either rage bait or promo for an OnlyFans. Perhaps the strangest thing about the tradwife ecosystem is how much it's impossible to tell who this content is for and what its purpose actually is. Just look at some of the biggest names in the genre. There's Nara Smith, who has often been highlighted in media as a bit of a face of the Gen Z tradwife movement, but who I have always found as a bit of an odd poster girl for the category. She obviously has a full-time job as a food content creator and a model, and while she did meet her older Mormon husband at the age of 17 and proceed to get married and have multiple children all within the span of a few years, and does occasionally flash the Book of Mormon in her videos, much of her most viral content could more easily be categorized as rage or engagement bait than straightforward portrayals of domesticity. I'm sorry, but her videos of making sunscreen, toothpaste, or chewing gum from scratch are obviously just meant to game the algorithm, and we're all falling for it. But her immense popularity, especially with young women, and her heavy focus on being a wife and mother are undeniable.
She's kind of the perfect storm. She is a supermodel. She is gorgeous. And, when you look at influencers, more often than not, they are conventionally attractive, let's be honest. And then she also has money. That kitchen is big and beautiful, and that fridge is, every single thing in that kitchen is pristine and expensive. She's, doing that tongue-in-cheek presentation where she's wearing a couture ball gown while she's cooking. Like this, it's so ridiculous, and she is so committed to the bit. Even the way every one of her videos is structured the same way. She starts it, she moves into the frame as she's pulling, the cutting board or the bowl or whatever. She uses the exact same song under all of her videos. It's very meticulously produced, and I think people discredit or don't realize how important that is. She also has a gorgeous supermodel husband and gorgeous little children. She is the epitome of, a life that people wish that they could have. And so, yes, people are watching because they enjoy it, but people are also watching because they love to hate her. I mean, the comments are pretty divided in terms of people saying that they love her, or people saying that she's stealing from other creators, or that she's pushing Mormon propaganda. And I believe she's winking at all of it deliberately because she's getting millions and millions of views. I think she and her husband were just profiled by GQ recently. She's doing very well for herself. And, she's very smart about the way that she has built this brand. I think it is inherently geared towards a white audience. And I would also add, I think that's slightly why Nara Smith is so bothersome to people, whether they want to admit it or not. Seeing a mixed race woman who has this idealistic life, it like sticks in their craw. It's like the Meghan Markle of it all. It's like, how dare this brown girl have all the things that I was promised? It does feel as if that vision of life is that 1950s Americana, and Black and brown people, queer people, we are not included in that vision. And that's not to say that if you are, a person of color and that's something that you aspire to, if you like it, I love it. But when it comes to capturing a large audience, unfortunately, in the influencer space, a lot of the big influencers are white. And it's not because their content is better. It's because they are appealing to a larger audience. And we are still in the minority in a lot of these spaces. And when it comes to, affluence and relatability and, an attainable life, rich white girls want to watch content from other rich white girls. They might be open to watching people outside of their demographic, but that's still, by and large, who dominates the influencer space. And in this instance specifically, that traditional quote unquote aesthetic lends itself to straight, white, Christian Mormons.
And going further into the parody genre, you have Lex de la Rosa, aka Tilted Neck Mom. Just search the term Tilted Neck Mom on TikTok and you will see both her content and the endless people parodying it. And listen, hate clicks earn just as much as love clicks. You have Estee Williams, who is perhaps your most classic case of tradwife content that seems to be bordering on OnlyFans promo and leans most heavily into the biggest stereotypes of the genre, and likely relies the most clearly on people engaging out of anger. Of course, you have Ballerina Farm, who has an entire chapter that we'll get into shortly. Then, tangentially related to the tradwife, as sort of supporters of the genre, you have people like Pearl, notorious content creator and commentator who has written a very specific vision of what it means to be a woman to, let's just say, some kind of success. Quote, she sees women as entirely at fault for unwanted pregnancies and the men who cheat on them, and it is obvious that this kind of content is designed to spark outrage, and outrage leads to attention and clicks, which in turn can create large followings. Davis's YouTube channel has amassed 1.6 million subscribers. She managed to gain over 900,000 followers on TikTok before she was banned, and this following has also led to mainstream media attention. Davis was recently invited onto Piers Morgan's show, where she was given a stern telling off, but her appearance has been viewed by 3.5 million people online. She also says things like women shouldn't be able to vote, don't belong in the workplace, are way past their prime after the age of 25, and many other bops. I would speculate that the only people who sincerely enjoy and engage with her content have got to be pretty exclusively men, but I would actually guess that even in that category, the sincere viewers is probably a relatively small portion of people who are watching this stuff, and most of her attention, even most of her subscribers, are probably at least to some degree hate watching her. But it's undeniably successful. Then you have cases like Taylor Frankie Paul of Mormon Swinger Talk. Quote, on May 20th, 2022, Taylor used one of her lip sync videos to reveal that she was separating from her husband, which she captioned, quote, an unfortunate announcement. Using audio from Miley Cyrus's Malibu, Paul showed off what appears to be a new set of keys standing in an empty home, with text in the video reading, in my 20s, getting divorced, started therapy, and living on my own for the first time ever, along with 2 little kids. You also have creators like the Sisters of Girl Defined, whose content about being godly wives and mothers has been more viewed through videos of people mocking it than on their actual channels. You have horrendous scandals like that of Ruby Frankie, which I honestly won't even get into here for fear of this video being flagged. Tangential to tradwives, you also have people like the Sprinkle Sprinkle Woman, aka Shira7. A YouTube and now TikTok sensation, the Sprinkle Sprinkle Lady presents a view of women that isn't quite tradwifey, but clearly presents an ideal in which women's financial prospects are directly tied to her femininity, physical presentation, and willingness to submit to a man. Quote, over the last several years, Shira has become one of the most controversial dating coaches on social media, as her views on being a kept woman have been criticized by many, offering women lessons on hypergamy and the art of leveling up. Shira first started her YouTube channel in November of 2011, featuring greatest hits videos such as Let Him Cheat. But at the end of the day, it's likely that content in this genre, which is not engagement baiting or trolling on some level, in light of how many people are likely to disagree with it on these heavily young and in many cases progressive skewing social platforms, this content may be baiting a different type of audience altogether, and in many cases leading them down a very specific social and political funnel. Quote, "The whole discussion can be a trap because the content itself is meant to be a heightened provocation. Some tradwife creators post things that they label as triggering opinions and then say that they get so much hate for being stay-at-home moms, but they rely on that dissonance in order to create more engagement, which leads to more clicks and money. Still, some tradwife creators appear to be popular if you look at their follower counts, and they certainly generate a lot of chatter, but I often think, who is this content for? Sure, some portion of their followers are probably like-minded women, but a new study from Media Matters made me wonder if the tradwife's main audience is actually right-leaning men. Media Matters coded and analyzed 327 recommended videos after exclusively interacting with tradwife content and documented what happened. We found TikTok's recommendation algorithm rapidly populated our For You page with conspiracy theory content and fear-mongering, which made up nearly 1/3 of all videos served to the For You page. Essentially, behind this movement, not just for tradwives, but to reclaim a very specific and in some ways patriarchal view of women's roles and femininity, there are some true believers. But for everyone who may genuinely believe that that is the correct path for women, or at least are living it authentically themselves, you have many other creators who are simply riding the algorithmic wave to prominence, based usually off of either male engagement or people yelling at them in their comment section. But at that perfect nexus of women who are actually living this lifestyle, unlike Pearl, and who have a, let's say, controversial at best online presence, we have one of the most recent scandals in the tradwife universe, Ballerina Farm. Which brings us to our next chapter, Ballerina Farm and Cosplaying America. As if it were a gift sent from the content gods themselves, a viral profile of the creator behind Ballerina Farm recently dropped, perfectly encompassing everything that's wrong with our current hetero marriage setup. Essentially, for those who aren't familiar, Ballerina Farm is the online brand of Hannah Nealman, the ludicrously popular lifestyle creator whose life on a Utah ranch with her husband and 8 children provides the backdrop for her content, usually centered on food, farm life, and just being very aesthetically pleasing. The profile centers on her marriage to her husband, himself the son of JetBlue founder David Nealman, and the role he played in her transition from Juilliard-trained ballerina to a digital domestic goddess. In short, the idea is that he intentionally sought out a beautiful, accomplished woman and made her his personal annexation, pivoting her to a world of babies and mother-centric beauty pageants and endless labor, as he doesn't want to hire any domestic workers, although he could handily pay for them. Now, there has been a lot of controversy since this profile was initially released. Hannah has spoken out about how misrepresented she felt in it, and there has been a huge amount of conversation on social platforms around the implications of this, whether or not we should be sympathetic to her story, whether she's actually a victim of her husband or of the broader Mormon church, which we'll get into shortly. And one doesn't have to look very far on TikTok now to find montages of her set to a sad cover of Girls Just Wanna Have Fun, specifically the lyrics, "Some boys take a beautiful girl and hide her away from the rest of the world." Many of her comment sections are now filled with people calling for her husband to give her a trip to Greece, which is a gift that she wanted one year when she instead received an apron to hold eggs in. More than a little symbolic. But in the ample conversation that this profile has sparked, there's been a powerful undercurrent of sympathy for this woman, and many commenters have pointed to the couple's ties to the Mormon church as evidence that she is just another in a long line of women sacrificed to the churning machine of religious patriarchy.
I look at Ballerina Farm and there's so much that I sympathize with because she is also Mormon. And I completely relate with what brought her there. And I know that I was just kind of one hair away from ending up there too. And sometimes I almost feel a sense of survivor's guilt for having made it out. But something that I think is unique about this and extra problematic is that on the one hand, we have somebody who was lucky in the fact that they got married and started doing the traditional family lifestyle, but they are actually being funded by billions of dollars. They have access to financial resources that most traditional wives do not. Most traditional wives are towing the line of poverty all the time because it's really hard to get a family by on a single income these days. And so that's, I think, an unfair depiction of what being a traditional wife really means and what it really looks like in the day-to-day. And she fortunately does have somewhat of a path that even if she were to leave, she has access to money from this guy to be able to support herself through some legal avenues. It's not going to be anything close to what she has while she's married to him, but she'll have access to something. And the reality is most women don't. If they were to ever try to leave, they would be lucky to get meager amounts of child support or alimony, if even that, if the husband even pays it. I mean, so I think we rely on these legal systems and the idea that, oh, but then if he dies or if something happens, there will be money, they'll take care of me. And that's just not true. And that's one of the inaccuracies that we see here.
But I personally find that a lot of this conversation around her and the over-sympathizing with her story to be a bit rich. First of all, although she was training to be a ballerina at Juilliard when she first met her husband, and that was ostensibly her dream at the time, she did marry into vast and immense wealth and then bought an extraordinary piece of property with him on which to raise a family. It's not as if she was thrown in prison. And also, let's be clear, no one forced the woman to make an extremely lucrative and professionally demanding online brand and media career out of that life. Also, if we really want to get into the weeds here, if you want to talk about career paths that are often extremely exploitative and physically demanding on women, and specifically on women's bodies, I suggest we read a little bit about the world of high-level ballet. The truth, though, about Ballerina Farm and many of these content creators, even people like Nara Smith, is that as much as they are presenting and even in some cases satirizing a very specific view of femininity, they're also presenting a very idealized view of American life. One where making everything from scratch and living on the family acreage is still the paradigm of American culture. As mentioned before, while this content does numbers on social media, we've been simultaneously making it essentially impossible for anyone not married into the jet blue fortune to support themselves doing it, especially in such fabulous clothing. Quote, "Farmers have always talked of looming disaster, but the duration and severity of the current crisis suggests an alarming and once unthinkable possibility that independent farming is no longer a viable livelihood. Small farms, defined as those bringing in less than $350,000 a year before expenses, accounted for just a quarter of food production in 2017, down from nearly half in 1991. In the dairy industry, small farms accounted for just 10% of production. The disappearance of the small farm would further hasten the decline of rural America, which has been struggling to maintain an economic base for decades." This farm obsession, as with the obsession of making everything from scratch, often to an intentionally comical degree, doesn't just flatter a certain image of women and their role in the home, it's a direct response to a world where these are dying arts, and where small farmers can no longer make a living, and where most of our food comes ultra-processed and removed from its source. Quote, "According to research from Northeastern University's Network Science Institute, more than 73% of the food supply in the United States is ultra-processed. Ultra-processed foods are distinguished by the ingredients that are added to them, such as artificial flavors and colors, and preservatives. They are also high in sugar, salt, and fat, and low in fiber and micronutrients." The truth, though, about being able to do things like run an aesthetically pleasing family farm, or stay home with your many children, or make absolutely everything you consume or put on your body from scratch, is usually just a question of money, or at least a question of time, which in families barely getting by comes down to the same thing. When again, most households rely on dual incomes to survive.
The social media trends, as with any influencer or any kind of social media presence, it's never going to show you the full picture. They're trying to sell you something, and they're trying to make it look aesthetic and beautiful and appealing. And there are things about being a traditional life that can be beautiful and appealing. I would love to be able to just not have to work and take care of my family, because it's a lot of work to take care of a family. But it leaves out the dark underbelly of all of the risk that's beneath it, and all of the dependency underneath it, and the exploitation underneath it, and the way that that woman really doesn't have freedom. She's entirely dependent on the man for her survival.
But if Tradwife content is in many ways a reversal of what's actually happening in American homes, on our plates, and in our farming communities, one area in which this content very closely mirrors what is actually happening around us is in our final chapter, The Church of Latter-day Capitalism. So it's no secret that Mormonism and content creation are a match made in heaven, no pun. Some of the most iconic and formative members of the child blogging community were in fact members of the Mormon Church, and much highly fascinating ink has been spilled on the reasons for this. Quote, "This cultural moment dovetailed perfectly with the Mormon belief that the intentional public sharing of joyful motherhood is something akin to a religious duty. For advertisers, it was a match made in heaven, and Mormon women were quickly ruling the algorithm game."
So in Mormonism, there's this belief that you can't make it to the highest level of heaven unless you're married, unless you're like sealed to a man if you're a woman. And that women don't even get access directly to God unless they're married to a man. And I remember when I finally had the courage to leave and get divorced, which is already really taboo in Mormonism, that people, even when they knew that I was leaving an abusive situation, would start saying things like, "But are you sure?" Because what about those like eternal blessings and things that you need? Once I kind of gave myself permission to not believe something, it didn't take long for the rest of it to come tumbling down. And when you start to acknowledge the patriarchy and abuse in your relationship, for me, it was very classic to the instant. It was very synchronous to the abuse and patriarchy in the Mormon institution at large. So it wasn't hard for me to start making those connections and to see how the same way I was oppressed in my marriage was the same way that I was oppressed in this religion. And it was the same way that most of the women I knew around me were oppressed and didn't even realize. A lot of them were in abusive relationships and didn't know and didn't have the means or ability to leave.
The culture of Mormonism encourages a kind of genre of family life, says Laura Vance, author of Women and New Religions. "It's such an oversimplification to call it an all-Americanness, but this way of being family I do think is very appealing, especially in the modern world where the reality of life is so much more complicated for many, many people. And even for those creators who aren't, like Ballerina Farm, explicitly Mormon, conservative Christianity looms large over this entire worldview." We can pop back over to the comments from JD Vance that we highlighted in the intro to see that it underpins this very specific view of womanhood and what women were made for. What were we made for? It's also worth noting that JD Vance converted to Catholicism after being raised evangelical, which both have their own special, unique Baskin-Robbins flavors of their views on women's autonomy. He really was like, "Give me the sampler platter." And it's no coincidence that content like this is immensely popular in a world where things like abortion rights are being decimated, LGBT families and individuals are under unprecedented attack, and the language of the right in America is becoming more overtly Christian nationalist. Now, for some, there also might be an element of if you can't beat 'em, join 'em in this whole thing. Like, if we're gonna slip back into a situation where women are effectively property of their husbands, might as well be hot property. But what's probably more realistic is that this content, at least some of it, is being very intentionally boosted. We have really good data on how much money is being thrown into right-leaning conservative media online, in part because the young people who dominate social media and consume this content are increasingly more progressive, especially young women. It just doesn't do organically nearly as well on these platforms, and going back to our earlier point about much of this being rage bait content, you can see that when they actually live on regular social media platforms, half of their comment sections are just them getting yelled at.
I had a viral TikTok about this where I said that motherhood is the ultimate MLM. I feel like so many of these moms are trying to rope you into motherhood as if they're going to get a commission for it without telling you what you're actually signing up for. And I think when it comes to the tradwife space, that's very much so, because again, you're seeing this very idealized version of motherhood, and especially at a time where our reproductive rights are under attack. It is very dangerous to have a child. There are places where you can't get access to abortion, and there are many people who want to have a child, and if there are health-related complications, would need an abortion and are not able to get one. So it is, disingenuous to push this idea of be a mother. It's so easy. It's so fun. It's the greatest joy in life, when the reality is it's very difficult, again, for people who are in their mid to late 30s, right? And maybe you can't conceive a child naturally and you want to get IVF. Well, now there are places in the US where you're not able to get IVF because it is equated with, falsifying life. If this idea that that life begins at conception, well, then IVF is off the table because all of those embryos that don't get used are seen as being aborted. So it does feel like everyone should be able to talk about their journey to motherhood or their experience as a mother, however they see fit. but it does feel like we're being sold a bill of goods. And again, I don't want to be conspiratorial, but the timing does feel very strange that as our reproductive rights are being stripped away, there's this influx of influencers that are like, you should be a mom, you should be a mom, look at how great being a mom is, while not disclosing if they have childcare, or if they used IVF to conceive of those children, if their parents were able to help. Are you still on your parents' health care? Do you have health insurance? Like all of these other things that make being a mom possible that are inaccessible to a lot of people.
But the immense popularity of some of this content is likely being directly supported. In fact, some of the earliest mom bloggers that we referenced earlier actually promoted the Church of Latter-day Saints on their blogs, had links to learn more about the church, and were in many cases outed for being directly funded by the church. And when much of this content is being directed at men and very intentionally leading them down farther and further right rabbit holes, it would make perfect sense for them to be funded by the political groups who stand to benefit from that very specific view of what a woman should be. But the real irony is that the girl boss archetype, the one that in many ways led to this pendulum swing towards traditional wife and motherhood, at least in terms of content strategy, is closer to these tradwives than your average wife and mother.
I think it's quite ironic that so many of them are Christian or Mormon, because I would just assume, I'm not a religious person, I'm a spiritual person, I would say. I would assume that it would go against their religious beliefs to participate so heavily in vanity and consumerism. I'm like, I don't think the Bible said anything about vlogging, but this doesn't feel like something, what would Jesus do? I don't think that he would be vlogging every aspect of his life and, dropping affiliate links and doing brand deals and using children as content. Like all of those things to me go against this idea of, being selfless and not being so focused on the aesthetic and putting material things on a pedestal and being so consumed with what other people think about you. But I will also add that historically, we know that a lot of religions are very hypocritical in, rules for thee and not for me. That is something that we've seen time and time again. Very often we see religious leaders that have been exposed for doing tawdry things that go against their religious beliefs. So that's not surprising. But I do think it's worth having a critical lens at sometimes some of the more insidious things that are being pushed, whether it be, thoughts about abortion, things about same-sex marriage, and not to say that those are things that the influencers we've talked about have participated in, but there are a number of quote unquote tradwives that are pushing this Christian fundamentalist ideas that line up with Donald Trump and, say untrue things about trans people and queer people. And sometimes they slip in very lightly suggestive, but still insidious ways. And to your point about it being aspirational, I don't necessarily know that people are always aware of how they are being influenced in more subtle ways versus overtly, oh, this is the life that I want, versus, oh, this is making me think about what it means to be a successful woman, what a good, quote unquote, good family looks like, what a successful woman looks like. All of those types of things, I think, are concurrent with the content that you're watching when it's being pushed through a religious lens.
At the end of the day, these content creators who make these huge lucrative platforms spreading a very specific ideal of femininity and motherhood are actually media entrepreneurs. Sometimes just creating content for smaller platforms, but sometimes leading massive audiences of millions of women and selling them physical products. Ultimately being a girl boss in this way, though, a girl boss who makes money via representing a specific model of womanhood, is at least a more palatable and, in many cases, doctrinally friendly way of earning your keep. Hilariously, these women are all probably way more financially independent from their husbands than the average wife is, all through advocating a worldview in which you shouldn't be anyway.
If you are going to go into that realm and offer unpaid labor to your husband and your family and your culture and your society, you have to go in eyes completely wide open. Otherwise, it's taking a huge gamble. there is a chance that maybe you're going to marry some guy who's going to make a ton of money and take care of you. And if you ever leave him, there will be ample child support and alimony to keep you going. But chances are that's not going to happen. And the number of women that I have met is, I've completely lost count, who find themselves in these situations where they just can't leave. They're multiple kids in, decades in, with no career, and they're completely reliant on their partner. And at the beginning, it was beautiful and wonderful, and they loved it. And now suddenly they're in their 50s and realizing, I need out and there's no way out. And it's so important to be able to have your own avenues of independence and economic self-sufficiency so that you're never reliant on somebody else's choices, especially if it's someone who's willing to exploit your labor for free and expect it from you just because of your gender, that they're entitled to your free labor. If you're going into these situations, that partner needs to be completely aware of the economic sacrifices you're making and completely willing to compensate you for that. If they're not in a position that they can financially compensate for that or put together some kind of a prenup or postnup that accounts for that labor, you shouldn't be doing this. And the reality is most people who subscribe to the Tradwife movement have no idea about the economic impacts, and they wouldn't dream of signing a prenup.
Ultimately, Tradwives, just like the girl bosses before them, are selling a very false answer to a very real problem. It is true that women are stretched very thin at work and in the home. It's true that husbands are not able in many cases to earn enough to support their families. It's true that not everyone wants to be in the workplace or wants to prioritize her career over having children. And it's true that in many cases, the food we eat, the lives we live, even the hobbies we engage in are dominated by cheap consumerism and completely removed from the roots of their production. Things like homemade food, the family farm, or even just being able to spend time with your kids really are becoming relics of a different time period. But the answer is not just putting on an expensive apron to hold a bunch of eggs and making extremely aesthetically pleasing content about it. First of all, because it doesn't provide solutions to those problems for anyone but women who are already wealthy enough to make the choice to stay home, but also because in many cases, content like this and the messaging it gives helps to feed the rise and dominance of the religious right, which would seek to enforce that role on women. We're just now, as millennials and Gen Zers, removed enough from a world in which women didn't have any of these choices to forget why they fought so hard to have them in the first place. When they couldn't own their own home or have their own credit card, when they were trapped in unhappy or abusive marriages, when they were forced to have children they didn't want or couldn't support. This wasn't some extreme case, this was daily life for most women. And just because the girl boss was a trend worth rejecting doesn't mean its opposite is worth embracing. So my advice when you're scrolling and you see stuff like this is A, if it's clearly engagement or rage bait, don't give it the time of day. People are building entire media empires off of you getting mad at them, and it's really, I mean, come on guys. We say boomers have terrible media literacy and they're falling for insane conspiracy theories on Facebook, but yet we're sitting here arguing over whether or not Nara Smith is trolling when she says that she made her husband sunscreen from scratch. Come on! We should be able to follow any kind of account we want to, and if what you want to watch is someone living on a farm, making things from scratch, staying home with her children, that's more than okay, but at least try to follow women who are doing it in a somewhat authentic and transparent way, who aren't being funded by some out-of-frame billionaire or backed by mega churches, or in any way selling a lifestyle that is totally out of step with financial reality. We can start to reclaim a simpler life, and it's okay to want to be a wife and mother. But the answer to helping more women make that choice is going to be an economic policy, not really pretty content. And especially not in rage bait. Come on, guys. Stop giving them attention. Anyway, thank you guys for hanging out with me, and I will see you next month on an all-new video essay.